The applause always sounded louder when the lights were blinding. Beneath the fire-breathing spectacle, the thunder of sold-out arenas, and the mythic armor of rock stardom, Gene Simmons spent decades hiding from a silence he could never fully escape. For years, the world believed he had mastered love without surrender, a man who built his identity around freedom, excess, and emotional distance. But behind the painted face was a frightened child shaped by abandonment, warm memories passed down through bloodlines, and a terror of becoming emotionally dependent on anyone. And then there was Cher. She was not simply another romance buried beneath celebrity headlines. She became the woman who saw through the armor long before the rest of the world realized there was a wounded man beneath it. Their relationship unfolded during the chaos of fame, but something inside Gene kept pulling him away whenever intimacy became real. For decades, he laughed off questions about marriage as if commitment itself were a joke. But now, at 76, the confession finally arrives. Was it ego? Fear? Trauma? Or did Gene Simmons spend his entire life running from the one thing he secretly wanted most? Long before the screaming arenas, the explosions of fire, and the monstrous face recognized across the world, Gene Simmons was a quiet immigrant boy standing beside a window that looked out over a cold and unfamiliar city. The nights felt endless back then. Sirens echoed through narrow streets. Apartment walls carried the sounds of neighboring families surviving one difficult week at a time. Inside those cramped rooms, silence often spoke louder than conversation. His mother moved through life with the invisible weight of history pressing against her shoulders. She had survived horrors that refused to disappear completely, even in peace. Some wounds never announce themselves aloud. They reveal themselves in habits, in fearful glances, in the way a person locks a door twice before sleeping. Gene absorbed those fears long before he understood them. Childhood became less about innocence and more about observation, studying survival, studying pain, studying how emotionally fragile the world truly was. At school, he felt invisible. His accent separated him from others. His clothes never carried the effortless confidence of the children around him. While other boys chased popularity, Gene watched from the edges, quietly building fantasies of escape inside his mind. He discovered music almost like a secret doorway into another existence. The louder the records became, the smaller his loneliness briefly felt. But something darker slowly formed beneath those dreams. He began associating vulnerability with danger. Dependence looked terrifying. Need looked humiliating. Somewhere deep inside, the frightened child created an emotional contract with himself. No one would ever have enough power to destroy him emotionally. If he became larger than life, untouchable, impossible to reject, perhaps the fear would finally disappear. Years passed, and the transformation began. He changed the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the way he entered a room. Reinvention became survival. The shy immigrant child slowly buried himself beneath ambition, confidence, and performance. Every achievement strengthened the illusion that emotional distance meant safety. Yet isolation followed him everywhere. Even in crowded rooms, Gene often felt strangely detached, as though he were watching himself perform rather than truly living. The narrator reveals the contradiction already taking shape inside him. The future rock legend desperately wanted connection while simultaneously fearing it more than failure itself. The chapter moves through dim rehearsal spaces, cheap equipment, cigarette smoke hanging beneath weak ceiling lights, and restless nights spent dreaming about fame powerful enough to erase insecurity forever. Music became more than ambition. It became armor. And armor, once worn too long, eventually begins replacing the person beneath it. As adulthood approached, Gene stepped closer toward the identity that would later conquer the world, the demon, the untouchable icon, the fearless rock god. But buried underneath the coming spectacle remained a lonely boy still terrified of abandonment. Then, somewhere ahead in the unfolding chaos of fame and celebrity, another force quietly waited for him. A woman capable of seeing through every layer of makeup, ego, and performance. And for the first time in his life, that possibility frightened him more than obscurity ever had. By the time Kiss erupted into global fame, Gene Simmons no longer resembled the uncertain child who once stood silently at the edges of crowded rooms. He had transformed himself into spectacle, leather armor, black and white paint, towering boots, fire erupting into the darkness as tens of thousands screamed his name like a ritual. On stage, he appeared almost inhuman, a creature built entirely from confidence and control. But fame has a way of magnifying emptiness instead of curing it. Behind hotel doors and backstage corridors, silence still found him. The nights became repetitive despite their excess. Endless interviews. Endless admiration. Endless movement between cities blurred together beneath flashing cameras and artificial light. Everywhere he went, people wanted something from him: attention, charisma, mythology, performance. Very few searched for the person underneath the character because Gene himself had spent years hiding that person from the world. Then came Cher. She entered his life carrying her own understanding of celebrity loneliness. She had already survived fame's machinery long enough to recognize emotional performance when she saw it. Where others admired Gene's arrogance, Cher noticed hesitation beneath it. Where others saw confidence, she sensed exhaustion. Their connection unfolded quietly at first, hidden beneath the chaos surrounding both of their careers. The chapter slows into intimate moments rarely seen by the public. Dimly lit restaurants after midnight. Conversations stretching long after parties ended. Hotel balconies overlooking sleeping cities while distant traffic hummed beneath them like fading static. Around Cher, Gene occasionally stopped performing. The volume of his persona lowered. He listened more carefully. Laughed more honestly. And that terrified him. Because intimacy demanded exposure. Cher began noticing contradictions inside him that few others ever recognized. The man publicly associated with freedom and excess carried strangely defensive emotional walls. Whenever conversations moved too close to vulnerability, he instinctively redirected them. Humor became distraction. Work became escape. Fame became shelter. Yet despite those defenses, their relationship deepened. For brief moments, Gene allowed himself to imagine a different version of life, one not entirely built around emotional distance. Cher represented something dangerous because she did not seem interested in the myth. She wanted the human being underneath it. And the closer she moved toward that hidden person, the more old fears awakened inside him. The narrator slowly returns to the emotional roots planted during childhood. Dependence still felt unsafe. Love still carried the threat of loss. Marriage, in Gene's mind, symbolized surrender, the possibility of someday being emotionally abandoned after finally allowing someone complete access to his inner world. So he kept retreating. Sometimes physically through work and touring. Sometimes emotionally through detachment. The pattern repeated itself quietly but consistently. Cher sensed it long before he could admit it aloud. There were moments she looked at him with the sadness of someone realizing they could not save another person from wounds he refused to confront himself. Outside, the world continued celebrating Gene Simmons as the embodiment of male freedom and rock and roll excess. Inside, another battle unfolded entirely unseen. One night, after another emotionally evasive conversation drifting into silence, Cher reportedly asked questions Gene struggled to answer honestly even within his own mind. Why did closeness frighten him so deeply? Why did he keep sabotaging emotional safety whenever it became real? He offered explanations. Career demands. Independence. Personal philosophy. But none of them fully explained the fear in his eyes whenever vulnerability entered the room. And slowly, painfully, the relationship approached a crossroads neither of them could avoid forever. Because love was asking Gene Simmons to become emotionally visible. And visibility, to him, still felt dangerously close to destruction. The empire kept growing. Every year seemed louder than the one before it. Stadiums expanded. Merchandise multiplied across continents. Television appearances, interviews, tours, endorsements, the machine surrounding Gene Simmons no longer resembled ordinary fame. It had evolved into something industrial, relentless, almost impossible to escape. The demon became more than a stage character. He became a global brand recognized by millions who believed they understood the man beneath the paint. But fame often traps people inside the version of themselves the world prefers most. Gene learned that lesson slowly. The chapter unfolds beneath the exhausting rhythm of celebrity life. Private jets cutting through dark skies before dawn. Hotel suites glowing with artificial light while entire cities slept below. Crowds roaring with devotion while backstage hallways remained strangely hollow once the noise disappeared. The louder the world celebrated him, the more detached he quietly became from himself. Control became his emotional survival mechanism. He controlled his image, his business decisions, his interviews, his relationships. Emotional distance protected him from unpredictability. Temporary connections felt safer than permanent ones because temporary things could disappear without devastating him completely. Over time, detachment transformed into routine. And the world rewarded it. Magazines celebrated his bachelor lifestyle. Interviews turned emotional avoidance into mythology. The public saw confidence while failing to recognize how carefully constructed it truly was. Gene himself sometimes struggled to separate the performance from reality anymore. Years of playing the untouchable man slowly made genuine vulnerability feel unfamiliar. But aging changes even the strongest illusions. The chapter darkens emotionally as time begins forcing reflection upon him. Friends changed. Relationships faded. The music industry evolved. The adrenaline of youth slowly gave way to quieter nights filled with memory instead of movement. And in those silences, unresolved emotions became harder to outrun. Cher's memory lingered persistently beneath the surface of his thoughts. Not necessarily as regret alone, but as evidence of a path he once almost took. A version of himself that nearly allowed emotional intimacy to exist without fear. The narrator carefully explores how memory can haunt people not because something ended, but because it revealed possibilities they later buried. Gene began recognizing uncomfortable truths about the architecture of his life. Fame had protected him financially, socially, professionally. Yet emotionally, it had also insulated him from authentic closeness. The armor he created during childhood had succeeded too well. He had built walls so effective that even he struggled to climb back over them. There were moments now, quieter, older moments, where the applause no longer drowned out loneliness completely. The chapter moves through reflective imagery, empty arenas after concerts, makeup slowly removed beneath dressing room mirrors, long pauses during interviews whenever conversations approached emotional honesty. The demon remained powerful on stage. Off stage, the man beneath him appeared increasingly reflective, increasingly aware of the emotional cost behind decades of self-protection. And eventually, one realization became impossible to avoid. Perhaps independence had never truly been freedom. Perhaps it had been fear wearing confidence as disguise. That thought settled over Gene Simmons like a shadow he could no longer ignore. And somewhere ahead, waiting beyond years of avoidance and carefully controlled mythology, came the confession that would finally force him to confront the truth publicly. Age changes the sound of memory. At 76, Gene Simmons no longer moved through life with the same urgency that once fueled decades of relentless ambition. The pace had slowed. Interviews felt more reflective. Silences lasted longer between answers. The armor remained visible to the world, but time had begun softening the man beneath it. And with age came honesty. The chapter unfolds in a quieter emotional atmosphere than the chaos of earlier years. Gone are the deafening arenas and explosive performances dominating previous chapters. Instead, the narration lingers inside thoughtful conversations, dim backstage rooms after shows, and long stretches of introspection where Gene appears less interested in protecting mythology and more willing to confront reality. For decades, he had publicly treated marriage almost like a philosophical rejection, a symbol of lost freedom, emotional dependence, and unnecessary restriction. Audiences laughed. Interviewers played along. The image of Gene Simmons as the eternal bachelor became deeply embedded within popular culture. But behind those answers lived something more fragile. The narrator slowly peels away layers of performance, revealing how deeply fear shaped many of his emotional choices. Childhood insecurity never fully disappeared beneath success. The survival instincts inherited from earlier wounds remained active even during moments of happiness. Vulnerability still carried emotional danger inside his mind. And nowhere did that fear become clearer than in his relationship with Cher. As Gene reflected on the past, he began acknowledging truths he once avoided publicly. Cher had seen him differently than most people did. She recognized tenderness behind the spectacle, loneliness beneath confidence, hesitation beneath arrogance. Loving someone who truly saw him required surrendering emotional control, and control had become essential to his identity. The possibility of emotional devastation terrified him more than isolation itself. So he protected himself. The chapter carefully explores the psychology of emotional avoidance. Gene convinced himself that independence guaranteed safety. If no one gained complete access to his heart, no one could destroy it completely either. Yet over time, he slowly realized the contradiction inside that philosophy: avoiding pain also meant avoiding deeper intimacy. The emotional weight intensifies as the narrator reflects on how many men of Gene's generation survived emotionally by suppressing vulnerability altogether. Ambition became armor. Ego became defense. Success became distraction. But unresolved fear never truly disappears simply because life becomes louder. Now older, Gene appeared increasingly aware of what emotional self-protection had cost him across decades. There is no dramatic breakdown in the chapter. No theatrical moment of collapse. Instead, the power comes from restraint, from a man finally speaking truths he spent years disguising behind confidence and humor. Regret exists, but it feels quieter than expected. More reflective than explosive. The narration lingers on subtle details, thoughtful pauses before answering questions, distant expressions during interviews, moments where Gene seems to study his own memories as though seeing them clearly for the first time. He finally understood something painful. The refusal to marry had never been entirely about freedom. It had been about fear. Fear of dependence. Fear of abandonment. Fear of giving another person the power to wound him emotionally. And once that truth emerged publicly, the myth surrounding Gene Simmons shifted forever. The untouchable rock icon suddenly appeared startlingly human, not a man incapable of love, but a man who feared needing it too deeply. Yet even after the confession, another question lingered painfully in the silence surrounding his reflections. Did understanding the past finally bring peace? Or did clarity simply illuminate everything fear had taken away? In the end, the makeup never fully explained the man. The towering boots, the fire-breathing spectacle, the monstrous persona created by Gene Simmons became one of the most recognizable images in music history, but age slowly stripped away the illusion that performance alone could define a human life. Beneath decades of mythology remained the same frightened child introduced at the beginning of the story, still searching for safety, still learning how fear quietly shapes identity. The final chapter unfolds with a reflective, almost haunting atmosphere. Concert lights fade into memory. Applause becomes distant. Dressing rooms once overflowing with noise now feel quieter, slower, more intimate. The narrator moves carefully between past and present, showing how Gene's emotional journey was never truly about celebrity excess alone. It was about survival. About control. About the lifelong struggle between vulnerability and self-protection. Cher's presence lingers symbolically throughout the ending. Not simply as a former relationship, but as the emotional crossroads where Gene came closest to dismantling the walls surrounding himself. She represented possibility, the version of life that might have existed had fear not remained stronger than trust for so many years. The narrator avoids romantic fantasy, instead presenting their story as something more universal and painful, two people meeting at the edge of emotional intimacy while one of them remains too frightened to step fully forward. As Gene reflects on his life, the contradictions become impossible to ignore. He achieved extraordinary success. Wealth. Fame. Cultural immortality. Yet emotional wounds from childhood continued echoing quietly beneath every achievement. The armor built to protect him eventually isolated him as well. And still, the chapter does not end in despair. There is dignity in self-awareness, even when it arrives late. There is courage in finally speaking truths hidden beneath decades of performance. Gene's confession transforms him from untouchable legend into something audiences recognize more deeply, a flawed human being carrying fears millions silently understand within themselves. The narration broadens beyond celebrity entirely, becoming a meditation on masculinity, emotional avoidance, and the hidden loneliness many people mistake for strength. Some spend their lives believing independence guarantees safety, never realizing how often fear disguises itself as freedom. In the final moments, the imagery turns quiet and deeply personal. An aging rock icon sits beneath fading lights after the crowds are gone. The makeup has been removed. The noise has disappeared. Only reflection remains now. And somewhere within that silence lives the truth Gene Simmons finally learned too late to fully escape. The greatest walls people build to protect themselves from heartbreak can also prevent them from experiencing the deepest forms of love. The demon conquered arenas across the world. But the man beneath him spent a lifetime trying to conquer fear itself.